There's a photograph from 1992 that bodybuilding fans still debate. Two men stand side by side under the lights of a Finnish ice arena. One of them is about to win the most prestigious bodybuilding title on the planet for the first time. The other had not competed in nearly 2 decades. And the man about to become champion, the man critics were calling the biggest, most conditioned bodybuilder who ever walked the earth, looks like he just wandered in from the junior division. The photograph continues to generate discussion in forums, on podcasts, and in gym locker rooms. At 64 years old, the man in that photo, 6-time Mr. Olympia Dorian Yates, has now addressed it. His account concerns more than a competition from over 30 years ago. It describes what it was like to stand next to a man who appeared to have been built by a different species entirely on the biggest night of his career. Before his first Olympia victory in 1992, Yates had been heavily influenced by Mike Mentzer and the principles of high-intensity training. He adopted a system built around 1 to 2 all-out sets taken to absolute failure, with intense focus and dramatically reduced volume. It was a complete departure from the stimulate, don't annihilate approach of his Olympia predecessor Lee Haney. While his contemporaries spent 3 to 5 hours a day in the gym, Yates was in and out in 45 minutes 4 days a week, and he was getting bigger than all of them. He called it blood and guts. The philosophy was straightforward. Fewer sets, maximum intensity, allowing for greater recovery and growth. Each set was taken to complete failure, the point where Yates himself had no strength left to raise or lower the weight. The principle was not time in the gym, but what was done during that time. And what he did during that time was something most people could not physically replicate. He was rowing 405 pounds for reps. He was shrugging 650 pounds. His back, wide, thick, grainy, almost grotesque in its development, became part of bodybuilding history before he ever set foot on a Mr. Olympia stage. There was also another side to Dorian Yates that made him as much of a psychological phenomenon as a physical one. Between competitions, he disappeared from public view. He turned down magazine covers, skipped guest posing tours, and avoided the politics and industry drama that consumed most elite athletes. He returned to Birmingham, to Temple Gym, to his journal, his barbells, and his record keeping. He logged every set, every rep, every meal, every night of sleep. He would vanish for months, then appear at the Olympia 10 to 15 pounds bigger and sharper than anyone expected. That pattern produced the nickname. People began calling him the Shadow because he materialized, won, and disappeared again. By 1991, the Shadow had become something more than a mystery. He had become a genuine threat to the greatest dynasty bodybuilding had ever seen. Lee Haney won the Mr. Olympia 8 consecutive times from 1984 to 1991, setting a record that at the time seemed untouchable. He was bigger than Arnold and more consistent than anyone before him. Gracious, powerful, and technically brilliant, he was a complete package who dominated the sport for nearly a decade without anyone coming close to unseating him. By 1991, the closest anyone had come was a Brit from Birmingham who had spent his teenage years in a detention center. Dorian Yates entered the 1991 Mr. Olympia and pushed Haney to the limit. At certain points, it looked like a draw, with Yates matching Haney's strong points across several rounds. In the end, Haney held on by the slimmest of margins. It was his 8th and final title. He announced his retirement the following year, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the throne was vacant. The bodybuilding world waited to see who would step in. The consensus pointed to Dorian Yates. He had the size, the conditioning, and the back that made judges' jaws drop. He stepped onto the stage at the Helsinki Ice Hall in Finland in September 1992, weighing roughly 260 pounds, with conditioning so extraordinary that individual muscle fibers were visible, a level of leanness that came to be known as grainy. Nobody had looked like that at that weight before. He was the favorite before the show began. The 1992 Mr. Olympia was held on September 12, 1992 in Helsinki, Finland, and it would become one of the most historically loaded events the sport had ever seen. It was the last Mr. Olympia staged outside the United States. Kevin Levrone made his debut and finished second. A young Ronnie Coleman, who would go on to win 8 Olympia titles, also made his debut and did not place. The night brought together future legends in their infancy, and one aging competitor making a final statement. And then there was Lou Ferrigno. To understand what Lou Ferrigno walking into that arena meant, it helps to understand what Lou Ferrigno represented to a generation of bodybuilding fans. He was not just an athlete, he was a symbol, and in many ways a living comic book character, who had become recognizable to people far outside the sport, including those who could not tell a barbell from a baseball bat. Louis Jude Ferrigno was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 9, 1951. He won an IFBB Mr. America title and 2 consecutive IFBB Mr. Universe titles, before becoming one of the most recognizable bodybuilders in the world, and then one of the most recognizable people on American television. He began weight training at age 13, inspired by the actor and bodybuilder Steve Reeves. From the start, the scale of Ferrigno's ambitions, his frame, and his capacity for building muscle set him apart. He grew up in Brooklyn, trained with single-minded intensity, and by his early 20s was already being discussed in the same conversations as Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most dominant bodybuilder of the era. Schwarzenegger stood 6 feet 2 inches and competed at 230 to 240 pounds. Ferrigno was larger in every dimension, standing 6 feet 5 inches and competing at roughly 275 pounds, with a physique built around the same strengths, enormous arms, a massive chest, and a presence that caused people to step back when he entered a room. The bodybuilding press devoted significant coverage to what a Schwarzenegger and Ferrigno matchup might look like. Magazine covers asked whether anyone could stop Lou, and whether he was the man who would finally defeat the Austrian Oak. Ferrigno's first appearance at the Mr.Olympia came in 1974, when he finished second to Schwarzenegger. He returned in 1975, and his effort to beat Arnold became the subject of the 1977 documentary Pumping Iron. The film altered the course of both careers. It moved a niche sport into mainstream culture, introduced a global audience to competitive bodybuilding, and established Ferrigno, even in defeat, as a recognized figure. The film cast him as the sympathetic underdog, determined, powerful, and emotionally vulnerable in ways that drew audiences to him, even as Schwarzenegger used psychological pressure and onstage superiority to dismantle his chances. Shortly after Pumping Iron, he was cast as the Hulk in the CBS television series The Incredible Hulk, a role he continued to play in various forms for decades. He became a household name well beyond the gym, recognized in living rooms across America. Children who had never heard of the IFBB knew Lou Ferrigno. They watched each week as a mild-mannered scientist transformed into a large green figure and tore through whatever stood in his way. The casting matched the man because off-camera, Ferrigno largely looked the part. He stepped away from competitive bodybuilding. He had a career, recognition, and a different kind of legacy to build. For nearly 2 decades, the man who might have been the greatest under different circumstances was absent from the stage. Then in 1992, that changed. Ferrigno was returning to competitive bodybuilding after 17 years away from the stage. He was 41 years old, weighing between 290 and 315 pounds, depending on which account you read, and he walked into Helsinki like he had never left. Joe Waiter had originally orchestrated the return with a specific vision. He wanted Ferrigno to square off against Lee Haney in what would have been a generational matchup, the legend of the 1970s against the king of the 1980s. Haney's retirement ended that plan before it started. The 1992 contest still carried its own intrigue, with a 41-year-old giant going up against Dorian Yates, the man who had just sparked the term mass monster. Going into the show, Ferrigno had kept his training approach similar to what he used in his prime, with one major adjustment. He paid significantly closer attention to his lifting form, maximizing each exercise rather than simply grinding through volume. The biggest change was his diet. He was eating roughly twice as much as he did in 1975, spread across 5 meals rather than 3. An older, smarter Lou had learned a few things about metabolism on the comeback trail. On the night of the show, when Ferrigno walked to the stage, the familiar trumpet blast of Gonna Fly Now from Rocky filled the Helsinki ice hall. 17 years of absence collapsed in an instant. The crowd erupted. People who had watched him on television as children were now adults in a Finnish arena, watching the Incredible Hulk himself mount the steps to the Olympia stage. One of those steps didn't hold. The stage floor at the Helsinki Ice Hall was temporary. The arena was primarily an ice hockey venue, and after the prejudging session, the floor had to be rebuilt for the night show, a process that wasn't done particularly well. When Ferrigno made his way up the large steps at the back of the stage, one of them collapsed. 300 pounds of Ferrigno came crashing down roughly 20 feet, leaving him with a nasty gash on his hamstring. He got up and walked onto the stage. The comparison round in a bodybuilding competition is what it sounds like. The judges line competitors up and call them out side by side, requesting specific poses so they can assess each physique against its direct competition. It is the most clinical portion of any bodybuilding show. Size, symmetry, and conditioning are measured not in isolation but directly against whoever is standing next to you. When the judges called Dorian Yates and Lou Ferrigno to stand next to each other, the result was something the arena was not fully prepared for. Dorian Yates at 260 pounds at 5'10" was the biggest, most conditioned man in the building. His back development was unprecedented. His overall mass, combined with the kind of razor-sharp conditioning that made his muscle fibers look individually carved, represented something bodybuilding had never seen before. By any objective standard, he was the most impressive physical specimen in the Helsinki Ice Hall. Then a 6'5", 290 to 315 pound man stood next to him, and Dorian Yates looked like he had wandered into the wrong competition. The photographs from that moment circulated through every bodybuilding magazine for months afterward. Dorian has spoken about it in interviews at length, and at 64, when he reflects on that night, there is something almost bemused in the way he describes the visual shock of it. The photo of the two of them semi-relaxed from the side became one of the most discussed images in bodybuilding that decade. Yates, who was about to become the most dominant force in the sport for the next 6 years, looked in that specific frame next to that specific human being, like a middleweight standing next to a super heavyweight. Dorian Yates was not small. Dorian Yates was never small. But Lou Ferrigno was something that existed outside the normal human scale of reference. He was 6'5" and built like a freight container made of muscle. The 7-inch height advantage alone changes every proportion in a side-by-side comparison. Add the mass differential, the broader skeletal frame, and 2 decades of Ferrigno's established physical presence, and the man who was about to win the Olympia looked like he was standing next to a different kind of competitor entirely. Dorian Yates has spoken openly about what it was like backstage, watching Ferrigno prepare in the wings. Every competitor at some point encounters someone whose physical presence is so overwhelming that it briefly affects their confidence. Yates was not a man who experienced that often. He had spent years making other elite bodybuilders feel that way about him, but on that night in Helsinki, he understood something about the visual power of Lou Ferrigno's size that no amount of conditioning could completely offset in the moment. It was a moment that reminded everyone in the building, judges, fans, competitors, and photographers that bodybuilding, at its most elemental, is about the visual statement a human body makes when it walks into a room. And Lou Ferrigno, at 41 and 17 years removed from competition, still made one of the most powerful visual statements in the sport's history. But the competition was not decided on visual impact alone. Ferrigno had said he mistimed his peak, sacrificing too much size in the final weeks of his preparation. Contest preparation had changed substantially over the 17 years between his Olympia appearances. The sport had evolved in ways that were almost unrecognizable to a man who had trained for the 1975 Olympia stage. Ferrigno later said that in retrospect he would have done several posing exhibitions before the contest to learn how to peak properly. There was a greater amount of muscularity, he said. They were bigger and much more superior in their leg development and in the back. That observation is central to what happened. When Ferrigno competed in his prime, the standard rewarded massive arms, a broad chest, and an impressive overall structure. That was enough to dominate. By 1992, the standard had shifted. The competitors around Dorian Yates had legs that looked like tree trunks and backs that resembled topographic maps. The Yates era had moved the sport from the aesthetics of Arnold, Zane, Banote, and Haney towards something more extreme, a new definition of what maximum human muscle development looked like. Lou Ferrigno, for all his size, was working from a standard that was nearly 2 decades out of date. The result was a finish tied for 12th place, ahead of veteran Samir Banote and a young Ronnie Coleman, but well behind Sean Ray, Lee Labrada, Kevin Levrone, and Dorian Yates, who finished 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st respectively. The judges scored what they saw. Size without conditioning, and without the modern standard of leg and back development that Yates had effectively defined, was not enough to win in this new era. The visual comparison had been dramatic. The scorecard told a different story. On the same night, a rat reportedly ran across the stage during Dorian Yates' posing routine. He kept going. That was characteristic of Yates. Little rattled him. Not the chaos of a busy stage. Not the spectacle of Lou Ferrigno standing next to him in the comparison round, and not a rodent appearing during his performance. He kept posing. He won the show, and he walked away as the new Mr. Olympia, the first of what would be 6 consecutive titles, beginning the most dominant run in the sport since Lee Hound's 8-year reign. The 1992 Olympia had been one of the most chaotic and visually striking nights in the sport's history. Dorian Yates later said it was his favorite of his 6 wins. It was his first, and although he showed no emotion in the moment, it represented everything he had worked toward from that weight room in Watton Detention Center. The rat, the collapsing stage, the Hulk standing beside him and making him look like an amateur. All of it was part of the same night that launched one of the most remarkable careers in the sport's history.